Even though we don't really hear it this way, sound at its most basic level is just air moving really quickly back and forth. The sounding object, whether it be a speaker, a string, or some vocal cords, gets set into motion and displaces the air around it in a pattern that basically follows the movement of that object. Even though we might think of the building blocks of music as being things like melodies and rhythms, or kicks and snares, or drones and beeps and boops, in the physical world, all sound really is amplitude changing over time. Now, if you're thinking, that's interesting, but what does that really have to do with music? All I really care about is my beeps and boops. I would say that you have a pretty fair point. If we didn't have any made-up parameters, and all we had was amplitude and time to make our music, we would be completely lost. We would have no idea what to do if we didn't have some limitations. We need to decide on some things to basically totally forget about and other things to focus on if we want to express something meaningful with music. But being aware of our fundamental assumptions is also pretty essential if we want to be able to do something new or be able to just work without being entirely confined within them. For the majority of human history, we've only been able to make music using acoustic instruments, and that gives us some pretty strict limitations on how we might conceive of the fundamental building blocks of music. The idea of playing a note with a keyboard is actually a pretty strict set of limitations when you really think about it. You have frequency, envelope, timbre, each a pretty big consideration in its own, all built into that concept. I would guess that for many people, the note is still the assumed fundamental building block of music, although that's definitely no longer the case, even with some of the most popular music in the world. Daphne Oram had other ideas about what these building blocks might be. She wanted to create sound by taking a few parameters like frequency, amplitude, and vibrato, and literally drawing out how they would change over time, completely independently of one another. She was a composer at the forefront of the development of electronic music back in the 1950s, a time when technology was just starting to catch up with her imagination. Oram, who joined the BBC in 1942, started the Radiophonic Workshop, which made all of the electronic sounds for all of the BBC radio productions at the time. She then left it shortly after to start one of the first independently operated electronic studios in the world. In addition to composing some beautiful and groundbreaking music, she devoted a large part of her storied career to building an instrument that could realize her unique reformulation of the fundamentals called Oramics. So let's take a look at Daphne Oram, who she was and what she did, the music that she made, her instrument Oramics, and how it can get us to expand our musical imagination even today. Daphne Oram was born in 1925 in Wiltshire, England, to a supportive but slightly unconventional family. Her dad invited a medium to her house when she was 7, who predicted that she would become a famous musician. Apparently, this later influenced her dad to let her quit nursing school so that she could study music. At a young age, her creative and inquisitive personality was already flourishing. With the help of her brothers, she built a radio transmitter that they used to broadcast music from their family home. And apparently she spoke about wanting to play the notes in between the ones on the piano, so evidently she was my kind of gal. As a young woman, she would join a wave of women entering the workplace to fill positions previously held by men who were now away fighting. In 1942, she was hired as a junior engineer by the BBC, where one of her jobs was to sync up a recording to live performances so that she could fade it in case the performance was interrupted by action from the war. She was already actively composing music in her spare time, and in the mid-1940s she wrote Still Point for turntables and live orchestra. This is still considered to be the first mixed media piece ever written. It was unfortunately rejected by the BBC and never played until 2016, many years after her death. Then in the 1950s, Oram got interested in the creative possibilities of magnetic tape. It was already becoming a popular recording medium at that time, but she was quick to realize its potential to transform sounds by recutting them, speeding them up, and slowing them down. She went to a senior BBC engineer to ask for some help and to borrow some equipment.
He reduced me to a very small height and finished by saying, "Miss Oram, the BBC employs 100 musicians to make all the sounds they require, thank you." I went into the broadcasting house late at night and collected from the listening rooms and of all the studios, and I worked until I believe I was rather grey.
Oram was obviously a pretty determined person, because even after such a dismissive rejection, she continued to campaign hard for an electronic music studio in the BBC for several years. And then in 1958, the BBC finally caved in and gave her a budget to start the Radiophonic Workshop, With the help of her colleague Desmond Briscoe, she would create all of the electronic sounds for all of the BBC radio productions. But the reluctance of the BBC to support her ambitions was weighing on her. Later that year, she went to the Journée Internationale de Musique Expérimentale at the Brussels World's Fair, where she saw the premiere of Poème électronique by Edgar Varèse. Looking at the score, it seems like she was not the only one who was interested in drawing music. The premiere of Poème électronique was a big deal in the world of electronic music, and after seeing such an amazing accomplishment by one of her contemporaries, Oram decided it was time to leave the BBC and start an electronic music studio in her own home. These days, having an electronic music studio in your own home is not really a big deal, but back then they really only existed in institutional settings. In fact, you could probably count all of the electronic music studios in Europe on one or two hands, so going out on her own was a pretty bold move. She financed her studio and subsisted off freelance work for advertisements, film, and the stage. Subsisting off freelance work? That's interesting. She did get some pretty cool jobs though. She did advertisements for big companies like Lego and Nestle, and even had some of her sound design feature prominently in the early James Bond films. Although it seems like her situation was a bit precarious and she lived modestly, she had the freedom to pursue the work she really cared about. And here she would compose her most famous works, like Four Aspects and Birds of Parallax. She would write 2 books, and of course she would get to work on the instrument that she'd been imagining since childhood, Oramics. So the Oramics instrument is the main focus of this video, but Daphne Oram was also a brilliant composer. The first piece I ever heard of hers is called Four Aspects. I discovered it on this record, an anthology of noise and early electronic music, and became totally obsessed. I used to read the liner notes as I listened, so I got to learn about Oram and her work as I discovered her music. The piece is based around a slightly melancholic melody that I think is a tape loop repeating back at different speeds. It's backed by this slow bass drum-like pulse, and there's some percussion instruments in the background that slowly go up and down in pitch. It evolves into this messy, hyperactive, noisy section in the middle before it returns to its original, more deliberate pace. But I think what's so interesting about this piece and others from its era is the aesthetic that comes from early electronic machines and tape. It makes me think about these people that were looking to a new medium to discover something new, even though they probably would have been seen as ridiculous by most people at that time. And the music that comes from these machines is a little bit bizarre, but I don't think it's for the sake of being bizarre. The sense that I get from Four Aspects is that it came from a place of deep curiosity and imagination. I mean, why else would you completely rearrange your life so you could make music like this all the time? So I've put a link to her album, also called Oramics, in the description below. And there you can hear some of the ads she did for Lego and Nestle back in the 60s, and it's definitely the most comprehensive collection of her work. So to use Oramics, you have to start by drawing out a waveform. Oram had this idea to use an oscilloscope in reverse, so instead of using it to display a waveform, she would draw out a waveform on a glass slide, place it on her modified oscilloscope, and then use it to produce the wave her drawing depicted. She then used rolls of 35mm film to automate different parameters of the sound by drawing out how they would change. She drew the pitch here, octave here, not entirely sure what's going on here. It's possibly a second voice so she could control 2 sounds at once. Because she was constantly updating and modifying the instrument, nobody's entirely sure what every part actually does. Anyway, on these lower parts she could control the amplitude, the frequency, and strength of the vibrato, and then maybe some other effects or some parameters of the second voice. Maybe someone out there knows, but I haven't been able to find out exactly for sure. The concept here is what really matters. So in order to give you a more clear idea of how Oramics works, I made a little demo version using Max MSP. So here's where you draw the waveform, which is like your basic starting sound. It's the equivalent of the glass slides that Oram would have used. And these areas would be like the different rolls of film. Here's where we set our pitch, and before we get too far into it, I'll just put something really simple on there. And the amplitude is at 0 right now, so we need to draw this out to hear a sound. Here's where we set how fast it reads through our little sequence, so let's take a listen. I'll change the waveform a bit so you can get an idea how that works. And let's add a more interesting melody. Here's where you can change the register. And definitely the coolest part, the vibrato. This one allows you to change the intensity of the vibrato, and this one is the rate. So as you saw in the demo, Oramix is pretty cool, but by today's standards, it is a fairly modest instrument. And obviously, it's amazing that she came up with this idea and realized it back in the 1950s, but it's not just the context that makes it interesting. This unconventional instrument gives us an opportunity to think more deeply about how sound really works, and I think that's a huge gift, regardless of whether we design synthesizers, make electronic music, or just love playing and listening to music. And drawing as a way of controlling sound has caught on in some pretty key ways, but I think there's still a lot of untapped potential still there. It's just so intuitive, and having visual feedback can be really helpful while you're creating. But to take Oram's thought and work in context, she was clearly a brilliant visionary. In today's world where electronic music is so accessible, it's a lot easier to understand the things she was thinking about 70 or 80 years ago. But back then, her ideas represented a profound break with some of the most widely held assumptions about sound and music. And I've intentionally not emphasized the fact that she did this all as a woman at a time when gender dynamics were very, very different than they are now. And that's because her ideas are just as interesting as anyone else's from that era. But the strength and determination it would have taken is a really big deal, and it's an even greater testament to what we all owe her as music makers and music lovers. Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching this episode of Sounds Good. I had so much fun making it. It was so cool to get to learn more about Daphne Oram. I've known about her for a while, but I really had no idea how truly amazing she actually was. I would love to be able to make these videos full time, and if you'd like that too, you can help make that happen by becoming a patron at patreon.com/soundsgoodchannel. Or you can just like and subscribe and share it with somebody who you think might like it.